Chapter 1. Strat ran, clutching the gillip he pilfered from the vendor's cart in a death grip. His hand, shaking from the cold, did not fail him as he lifted the apple from the pile. No one called out, alerting the vendor to his theft. Even the seller was unable to notice his tiny hand on the side of the stack, but that did not stop him from running pell-mell, once away from the cart, toward his home in the alley. The gillip, ripened to perfection, was the first food Strat would taste in days. He would enjoy the apple as if it were a grand banquet. For a stomach that had known only empty grumblings, it was going to be a magnificent feast. Nothing required his attention more than the red and yellow striped fruit in his hand. A gust of wind streamed his coat out behind him, making him wish winter would release its grip on Joron. Spring had officially begun 8 days ago, but the westerly wind still held the cold, pimpling his skin where it touched with icy fingers. Strat refused to place the gillip in a pocket for fear of it falling through a hole and pull his coat more tightly about him. His attempts to draw it closed with one hand met with failure each time. The air grew more frigid as the sun sank below the horizon. Aranost was supposed to be a time of growth and rebirth, but Untab, the last month of winter, refused to relinquish its hold over the country. Strat endured the unseasonably cold weather, sparing it little attention. It was the gillip in his hand that attracted his mind. Strat customarily waited until nightfall to venture into Greater Joron. However, gnawing hunger had forced his hand. His tattered clothing and filthy appearance marked him for what he was, a street urchin, an orphan. Knowing he would stand out amongst the citizens, he was forced to travel the streets before the sun had set. His fear of dying from starvation moved him to the decision, and it had paid off handsomely. Keeping to the shadows and back streets as much as possible, Strat kept his head on a swivel, looking for any of the city's civil force who might be searching the streets for children to sell to the brothels. Those who were not deemed worthy of keeping by the flesh peddlers found themselves rushed through a trial and swiftly hung from the gallows. The body would then be tossed in an unmarked mass grave, soon to be forgotten forever. And though he was malnourished, he had all his teeth. This made him prime meat for the flesh peddlers, and he would be a favorite in the brothels until someone killed him. His mouth watering in anticipation of the first bite of the apple, Strat made his way back toward the alley he currently called home. Located in the most violent section of the seaport, Seedy Acres, he would not trade it for a palace in Greater Joron. The thought of living among the swaggering, arrogant wastrels made his empty stomach want to relieve itself of the bile that was its only contents. As a particularly strong gust of wind pulled at his coat, Strat noticed the silence that had fallen within this section of the city. Looking about, he found not a single pedestrian on the street. The shops were open, the lights within falling on the paving stones. He stopped, trepidation gripping him tightly, and looked both directions. He scanned the rooftops and street with a practiced eye. There were only 2 reasons the lane would be deserted: assassins or the city civil force. Stepping back into the shadows, Strat paused, listening for any sound or movement that might indicate what group might be lying in wait. Try as he might, his ears could find nothing amiss. This does not mean there was no reason to fear. It suggested the person or persons were keeping as silent as he was himself. He waited, silently counting. 60 heartbeats. This was Strat's routine in situations of this nature. He would remain quiet and hidden, counting his heart's thumping rhythm. His rate only climbed when he was in imminent danger of being captured by the authorities or caught in the act of theft. And until he was given a reason to fear, his pulse would remain steady and even. Nothing. No one entered the street from either direction. Strat craned his neck to peer at the top of the building he currently rested against, searching for the movement that might indicate an assassin was preparing to strike. Again, nothing. He felt foolish, but always trusted his instincts when faced with these circumstances. The laws prohibiting the outright murder of unwanted children was still relatively new in Los Angeles, and he was taking no chances. The current ruler, King Colbert, had repealed the law permitting the hunting and killing of children. There was not a single city, town, or village that did not murder children when the law was in effect. Unfortunately, that law did not extend to orphans and street urchins. Those who were beautiful enough, young enough, and retained most of their teeth were sold to the brothels. Some might suppose this was a better life than the streets, but only a handful would survive beyond 6 months in those horrific establishments. For some reason no one could fathom, the adults of Los Angeles bore hatred toward children. Scholars were unable to unravel precisely when the people of Los Angeles turned bestial, killing unwanted babies. Husbands would beat their pregnant wives, causing miscarriages and killing more than a few of the women in the process. No familial lineage was safe from the madness that seemed to have swallowed the country in its merciless, malevolent grasp. It would not do for the past generation. Children were permitted to live because of the decline in population. However, this did nothing to stop mothers and fathers from tossing unwanted children into the streets to live and die by their wit, or selling themselves for a meal or room and a night out of the cold. King Cobalt's annulment of the law was not from benevolence. It stemmed from fear of his being invaded by a foreign country. The average age of men in the country was becoming worrisome to the insane ruler, and he abolished the law, killing those who spoke out against his decision. Children were given to the local authorities in cities all over Los Angeles. Parents might be permitted to kill their children, but they would not be forced to take care of them either. With the influx of so many, King Colbert decreed each city would train the children to become soldiers in the Los Angeles armies. Those too weak to complete the rigorous training would be given over to the flesh peddlers. The children refused by the flesh peddlers were summarily killed and tossed into mass graves outside the city walls. Casting one last look around, Strat pushed away from the wall and continued on his way. The feeling of being watched did not leave him. He kept searching the alleys and buildings as he made his way toward the quiet solitude of his home. Gillip in hand, Strat rounded a corner that brought him onto Stellan Road, or as the locals called it, Warlock's Way. Those who practiced the dark and forbidden arts were relegated to Warlock's Way. This was another of King Colbert's decrees. Sorcerers, warlocks, necromancers, enchantresses, and occultists plied their trade on Stellan Road. This proved to be a boon to the mages. It meant they would not be bothered by the city civil force, and their clientele could seek their services without being accosted by Greater Joron's authorities. Not even the city civil force entered Seedy Acres unless they were in a large group. The seaport had become a stigma because of the bandits who once held the docks. Since the establishment of the Enforcement Coalition, it was just now a busy seaport with hardened people who had no qualms about killing. In fact, the streets around the port were rarely frequented by the sailors who landed at the docks. Even those tough men who sailed the seas of the world were careful in Seedy Acres. Strat did not understand why the practitioners of the dark arts were considered undesirable by those in Joron. The seaport once used to be the whole of the city at one time. People now referred to the newer section of Joron as Greater Joron. This did nothing to sway his image of the men and women of Seedy Acres. All of them seemed affable and genuine to him. Unlike the wizards who believed themselves superior practitioners of the darker arts, those men were still self-centered, serving assholes. Kelton, a charlatan who had held a shop on Warlock's Way, was about the only establishment on Stellan Road sailors would visit. This was not because of his power or the goods he sold. It was the first building on the street from the docks. This meant, fresh off the ship, men would not have to venture into the rougher section. His place stunk nearly as much as the alley Strat called home, but that did nothing to stop visitors from the seaport. The locals knew to stay clear of Kelton's. He was a fraud of the highest order. Only in the Enforcement Coalition's laws kept the people from burning the shop and the shopkeeper to the ground. Even this man was more polite and affable than any wizard in Greater Joron. Strat could not shake the feeling he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His attempts to shrug it off failed. In fact, the feeling grew with every step that brought him closer to his alley. Rubbing the back of his neck, Strat stepped into the shadows between two buildings, searching one again for the cause of his unease. Wiping his grimy hand on his cloak, Strat transferred the gillip to the other hand and repeated the process. This did nothing to remove the grime embedded in his skin, and only made the stains on his coat worse. He waited out his count, then moved down the street, keeping close to the shops lining the eastern section of the road. Making one final turn into the safety and security of his alley, Strap bumped into someone who had, by the smell, just pissed on the ground. 3 years he had been in this place, and all that time no one had ever entered his alley. The proximity to Kelton's stinking shop kept even the locals from using this to cross over to the next street. Yet someone was standing right in the middle of his sanctuary. His first thought was this man could be the reason for his unease. His second was, what the fuck was he doing there? "What have we here?" the man asked. "My fault," said Strat, sidling past the man who spoke. He noticed an odd gleam in his eye and began to fear for his safety. A tiny movement to his left caught his attention. A second man leaned against the wall of Kelton's shop. "My fault," he said again. "I should have been more mindful of where I was walking." "Eloquent speech for such a young boy," the leaning man said. "You're so right," replied the man Strat bumped into. "What are we to do about you causing me harm, boy?" Of all the days for someone to stop and piss in his alley, why did it have to be today? This was the first time in days he would have food in his hand or his stomach, and now he was being confronted by two men who should never have been here in the first place. These two were looking for trouble, or his name wasn't Strat. The fellow we bumped into was still ham-handedly trying to tie his trousers. This one was going to be the hardest to convince the collision had been an accident, and to allow him to leave. His friend, leaning against the wall, seemed inclined to watch the proceedings without interference. Either way, this was going to be a tenuous situation, should he not convincingly plead his case. "I apologized," Strat said matter-of-factly. "Nothing else needs to be done." "The little whelp has brains," the second man intoned, his voice steady. Swallowing the sigh threatening to escape his lips, Strat knew he was in trouble. The man nonchalantly leaning against Kelton's shop was perfectly sober. The drunk, still trying to lace up his trousers, might not be able to catch him should he run, but his friend was more than capable. "Brains or no brains, he's going to pay for running into me." Strat pocketed the gillip forlornly. His only wish was to wash the fruit and devour its sweet, succulent flesh. This situation was escalating quickly, and he wanted the apple out of harm's way should he be forced to run. Judging from the man's level of inebriation, which seemed a bit forced, his friend's apparent indifference, it was likely he would have to run for his life before this was over, and his only thought was to keep the fruit safe until such a time as he could enjoy it. The westerly winds chose that moment to blow through the alley. The man he bumped into nearly vomited when the smell assaulted his nose. The man leaning against Kelton's shop pulled a handkerchief from his vest and held it under his nose. Strat took the opportunity the winds provided to put a few feet of distance between himself and the men. "What are you talking about?" Strat demanded, thinking furiously. This one-time instance when an ill-timed intervention from the city civil force would give him the seconds he needed to escape, did he lament the Seafort's reputation. "Please just leave me alone. I apologized. Isn't that enough?" "I've been You owe me," the man said, spittle flying from his lips. "For bumping into you?" Strat asked incredulously. Stepping back, he knew there was no way to reason with the man, and his companion appeared to be enjoying his discomfiture. Strat decided at that exact moment he would be better served by attempting to escape. He bolted toward the back of the alley. There was a small escape hole in the fence connecting the street behind his alleyway. He could wiggle through, leaving the two men far behind. There was no way the man could catch him, and his friend seemed almost disinterested in the whole affair. He doubted the man leaning against Kelton's shop would give him chase, making his escape all but assured. At least it was his fervent hope the man would give no chase. "Come back," screamed the man he bumped into. "Looks like you've lost this one," the second man said, chuckling. 3 years Strat had been on the streets of Seedy Acres. 3 years spent running and hiding from the city civil force, assassins, thieves, Unbound, and the brothel owners. This was not by choice. It was his physically abusive drunkard father who cast him out when he was only 7 years old. No thought of whether he would live through the day, let alone years fighting for survival among grown-ups who wanted him for his body or dead. Years of avoiding precisely what was occurring now. A third of his life had been spent on the dirty, perilous streets of Seedy Acres, and not once had he thought about his father. He had dismissed the man from his mind as surely as the sun rose and set each day. Strat's assumption of the man leaning against the wall, not participating, was erroneous. He could hear him giving chase. He knew if he turned his head, the man would surely catch him. There was not an adult to date who could apprehend him, and this was not going to be the first time he was caught. Another supposition that was quickly being shattered by the sound of footsteps gaining on him as he bolted for the hole in the wall that would see him safely away. Once he was out of danger, he would ponder how the man was able to close the distance, but for now his focus needed to be escaping this nightmare. Strat dove for the hole in the fence. There would have been more than enough time to stop and crawl through on his hands and knees with most pursuers. This was not the case with the man who had first appeared to be disinterested and had forced him to risk injury by trying to make it through while sliding across the ground. A firm hand clamped around his ankle just before he would be free. He struggled against the man's iron grip, grabbing the fence and pulling for his life. His antagonist was too muscular and pulled him back into the alley. Strat felt splinters cut into the flesh of his palms and fingers. Cursing, his coat and trousers now wet from the water puddled in the alley, Strat lashed out with a foot, catching the man in the shin with a well-placed kick. His captor only grunted and threw him to the ground. Cold seeped into his bones from the night air and the dampness of his clothing. He knew what was coming next. It was what all bullies did to those smaller and weaker than themselves. What all cowards did when they knew the advantage was in their favor. One thing that made all of them what they were: weaklings. Only weaklings would prey on those weaker than themselves. Rolling himself into a ball, Strat cried out as the first kick met his unprotected back. Quickly turning over, covering face and stomach, saving his spine from serious injury, he noticed the one who had caught him had assumed his nonchalant pose against the wall of the shop again. In his mind, the man leaning against the wall was worse than the one who was trying to kick his stomach through his back. Strikes rained down on him, sending searing pain along his arms and legs where the blows were landing most frequently. Strat was more concerned for his stomach, chest, and face. These he kept covered at all costs. One perfect blow landed with supreme luck would be the end of him, and he had no desire to stop living just yet. The streets, a vicious taskmaster, but he was more accomplished and wanted to stay alive and live out his days in the comfort of Seedy Acres. "Please stop," Strat sobbed. Strat's small frame was taking a beating, and he was weak from starvation. The man was enraged and physically muscular, making each blow landed to torment of muscle and bone. There was no telling when or if the man would stop. Even his apology did nothing to sway the man from leaving him in peace. "Stop," the man demanded. "I'll have what I'm owed." "Kick. You'll pay for bumping into me, brat." Strat stopped listening. He was focused on staying conscious. "Are you listening, boy?" "Kick. Don't you die on me." Strat grunted as a kick penetrated his defense, catching him in the stomach. He knew it could have been worse. Should the man's boot have found the spot just above his stomach where the chest met the abdomen, he would have been in serious trouble. Trying to catch your breath while someone was pummeling you into the ground would be impossible. Had it connected with his ribs, there was a chance one or more would break from the force. All he knew, beyond doubt, was he could not afford to lose consciousness. It would be the last thing he did before his antagonist killed him. A scene from his past floated back to him as Strat remembered a terrible night when he had been the target of his father's abuse. He was sitting at the table, eating soup when his father came into the house. For some reason he could never fathom, his father had taken the bowl of soup and smashed it into his face. Rising, gagging on chunks of potato in the soup, he tried to drink water to force the food down. The whole time his father was punching him in the back of the head as he struggled to clear his throat. A well-placed kick pulped the gallop against Strat's ribs. He felt liquid gush against his shirt and nearly uncurled to see how much of the fruit remained. The beating was horrendous, but the loss of the only food he had in his possession in days was almost too much to bear. His sobs were now for the loss of his meal, his lot in life, the thrashing he was receiving, and for his mother who died for nothing. Blow after blow rained down on him from the man, The severity and power were less now that he began to tire, but it did nothing to ease the suffering he was experiencing. Should this have been the beginning of the pummeling, he could have endured it with relative ease. However, his body was already battered and bruised from the onslaught, making each strike an agonizing torment. Spitting blood from a split lip, Strat knew he needed to flee. His abuser might not be slowing and losing strength, but he could turn deadly should he lose consciousness. Between two kicks, he tried to scurry away and gain his feet to flee. He hoped to gain enough distance between himself and his abuser to escape and find somewhere to hole up while his body healed. He knew it would be a long, slow process without proper nourishment, but that would have to be a bridge crossed if he could only escape. A fist hammered his left cheek, sending him crashing to the sodden ground. Filth filled his mouth as his face slammed against the mud-soaked earth, causing him to retch bile into the mixture. His throat burned where the acid from his stomach had passed. Adding insult to injury, he tried to roll into a ball once more, but his body refused to obey his addled commands. "You'll kill him," the man leaning against Kelton's building warned. "No, he'll just wish I killed him." "Do you remember what this is about?" the man asked, pushing himself off the wall. "Or have you forgotten?" "I don't care anymore." Pain flared in Strat's side. He had not regripped his knees, and the man's boot found his unprotected ribs. He was suddenly having difficulty drawing a full breath. When he inhaled, it felt like something bubbling within his left side. He knew the man had broken a rib and the bone had punctured his lung. Blood filled his mouth as he coughed. He coughed again and could not stop. Blood spilled from his mouth as he tried to draw a full breath. This only served to make his cough worse. There was no respite from the agony, nothing he could do to lessen the burning in his throat as he fought for air. Nothing he did could stop the agonizing, searing pain in his chest.